Hello, and welcome to Thinking Out Loud. I'm your co-host, Cameron McAllister.
And I'm your co-host, Nathan Rittenhouse.
So we were MIA on Tuesday of this week. We do apologize, but Nathan was without internet for quite a while. That was at least 3 days. Is that right?
Hey, I had a very minor hurricane experience compared to anybody else in the country. So I cannot complain about that when you look at comparatively what a lot of other people are still suffering from right now. So, yep.
Pretty unreal. Right. So and it's funny because we were just talking about one of the recommendations we just recently made was World Magazine. World Magazine, their offices are in Asheville. I don't know if you knew that, Nathan.
Oh, I didn't know that. No.
And so they had, I was looking at pictures actually of their offices. Of course, their office is one of many buildings that is underwater. Most of their equipment, everything was pretty much destroyed. All of their filming equipment and all their podcast equipment. So just was one point of entry into just the amazing devastation that we're seeing. So obviously a lot to be praying about. It's also been pretty remarkable, though, Nathan, to see people working together. I have numerous anecdotal stories about this. It's also been highlighted on the news, but you see total strangers getting together with chainsaws, moving trees, feeding people, just taking care of their communities. That's very heartening to see. So, yeah,
for sure. And I mean, so there are other glimmers of interesting goodness that have happened in recent days. We had a vice presidential debate where everybody used, for the most part, complete sentences and talked about actual policy. So that was, a pleasant surprise, I think, to the nation. So used words like "I agree with you" intermittently. So whatever you have to say about both of the candidates, something felt a little more sane about that version than some of the other political theatrics we've seen recently. So there's a little sign of something.
That's nice to see. Yeah, my one comment on that, Nathan, I mentioned this to you earlier, but it'll be interesting to watch. Everybody keeps saying, yes, this was a debate that was kind of a model of civility and a throwback to more robust political conversations where actual policy was being discussed. And that was refreshing, but it's not going to make any difference. I've heard that from a number of different sources. People don't vote for vice presidents. I'm not so sure about that this time around. This has just been a very unusual set of elections, shall we say, in recent years. I've seen a lot of sentiment to the effect that can we just have these two running instead of their counterparts? Both of them are so much more competent and confident, handle the issues with a lot more dignity. But anyway, I'll be interested to see how that develops. I wonder if we maybe see vice presidential, antics, debates, discussions swaying the election more than we have in the past this year. I don't know. We'll see.
So we're at a spot like
just one interesting.
Yeah, it's too soon to say, but it'll be interesting. Timestamp it there. Cameron's asking the question, so months later we can come back to this and say, Cameron, you were right or you were wrong, or we'll never know. Speaking of things that we'll never know exactly how they're going to turn out. So in the midst of all of this, you have Iran chucking a bunch of missiles at Israel. So we're in the phase here as the recording of this where that has happened. Israel has not responded yet. So we can only speculate on what the response might be. But Cameron, help us think through. Well, I don't know so what should we be thinking or feeling right now when we look at a situation like that? Because it's like the amount of unknowns and the what ifs. So you have, the stock market goes down and the price of oil goes up and there's speculation about this and this will mean this. And if this party gets involved, then this will happen. We seemingly have we're more aware because we're more globalized of all the potential possibilities of the way that something could go wrong. So I don't think there are many people who look at, okay, so let's say Iran chucks 181 ballistic missiles or whatever at Israel. And I haven't heard a whole lot of people say, well, here's a good solution to this. This is how I think this could end well. Like
Mhm.
we're past that being a categorical option of like a good ending doesn't exist in this really. Like even like we could say what's better
Yep.
perhaps, but we've kind of jumped the shark on happy endings politically speaking. When it comes to the Middle East. Am I being too pessimistic there, or is that just kind of
yes.
like naming the miry muck we live in this phase of whatever it is we're
No,
in?
you're being descriptive. So that's true. We are predisposed toward catastrophizing these days as well. That's true. But we also know from just the very recent past that Israel has proven that they will retaliate tenfold when when some form of agitation like this happens, an attack.
Well,
I think so.
see the
How
difference.
should we be feeling about?
Hang on a second, but you do have the April version where they didn't really respond to a not dissimilar attack.
That's true.
And I think that was a lot of the U.S. being like, okay, tone it down here. We don't need to escalate this. The question is whether or not Israel is going to listen to the U.S. on this next round, or if you're going to see some oil fields and ports on fire, or have seen that by the time this podcast comes out.
Yeah, I mean, how should we be feeling about this? I think a common refrain for us is we need to be slow and reflective as we look at this. I think the business of getting into wild predictions is never wise. What seems to me to be the case here is clearly I don't think Iran believed that most of these missiles were going to get through. They're dealing with one of the most sophisticated militaries on the planet. So this seemed to me to be there seems to be some kind of other strategy behind this attack. And so, I mean, what precisely that is, Nathan, you had some good thoughts about their, the way in which Iran has been allowing some other groups to do kind of its dirty work for it, and how that's becoming an uneasy alliance right now against Israel because other people are paying the price. I think it'd be helpful if you said a few remarks on that uneasy alliance, because I think that might help us make some, I don't think it's too speculative, but sense of this missile attack.
Well, so let's play this out and again, this is one possible option on this, but let's scroll back a year now. So you have an Iranian supported Hamas attack on Israel about a year ago. So Iran's behind that. So but none of this makes sense if you don't see Israel as a permanent enemy of Iran, as in like it shouldn't exist. So none of this will make sense outside of the ideology that, so you have Iran as a political unit and as a government. But if you can't wrap your heads around the ideas behind it, none of this makes sense. But let's just say that Iran doesn't want Israel to exist. So they're funding Hamas to attack Israel. Hamas does that. Of course, Israel catastrophically responds. I mean, just as far as like you poke the wrong barrel on that one, Hamas. But at the time that Israel responds to Hamas, then Hezbollah, which is also funded by Iran, in solidarity with Hamas, starts launching how many thousand missiles from Lebanon into Israel. You have tens of thousands of people evacuate out of Israel. Finally, Israel reaches some point where it's like, okay, enough of this. You got the pager incident, the walkie-talkie incident, and now you have Israel sending troops into Lebanon, and then Hezbollah top commanders being killed. And what kind of happens here is it looks like Iran's play here is to hurt Israel using other people as the collateral damage, so to speak. So right now, you don't have a lot of Iranians who have been deeply unsettled because of what's happened in Gaza or the West Bank or in Lebanon. And so basically, Iran is paying other people to suffer for their global strategy through a particular version of an Islamic vision of what's going on. What some people have suggested is that there either is evidence of, or very well could be, some animosity arising with Hamas and Hezbollah against Iran, of saying, look, we're the ones suffering from what you're doing. You're not doing enough to help us. And that this more recent missile attack is simply them saying, hey, look, we're doing something. even though they have to kind of know that it's not really, I mean, some of the missiles did get through, and we shouldn't be, we should never be like, well, only a couple of
Right.
ballistic
We don't
missiles
want
from one
downplay.
nation got into the other. We don't want to downplay that at all. But I think your point is right, that they had to know it wasn't going to be massive. It is more of a symbolic thing to say to their people, hey, look, we're doing something, while at the same time trying to not deeply endanger their own citizens. And there might be some internal tension within the kind of political nature and structure of Iran at the same time. So that would make it into a situation where Iran is attacking out of a sense of like, well, we got to look like we're doing something. And it's more of a, symbolic kind of thing. But the flip side of that is you only need one missile to make it through with a warhead you purchased from North Korea in order for it to be game over from Israel. So Israel doesn't really have the luxury of saying, well, this isn't that serious. I mean,
right.
There's so that's you can't really know, and that's and so people are going to be making decisions based off of crippling the capacity of their enemies because they don't know exactly what it is that their enemy has planned.
So that brings us to an interesting juncture here in this conversation, and that is, this is the moment where we feel like we have to climb into a time machine a little bit, because it's true. Israel can say, yeah, symbolic or not symbolic. That doesn't take away the fact that we have a possible existential threat to our people. We're talking about nuclear. We're using the word nuclear again here in a way that we seem to think that this was a thing of the past, I think. A lot of analysts, of course, and shrewd politicians and scientists actually have said, no, this threat, this concern has never gone away. Yes, we're well past the Cold War. But you asked a very revealing question earlier, Nathan, when we were discussing this a little bit. I wonder if you remember your question.
Yeah.
Most Americans. It's a question to most Americans. Pose that now, and that'll bring us into this region of the discussion.
So I'm saying this provocatively to get you to think, and we're going to have to talk about Mersheimer and like thinking like different nations and 19th century actors and whatnot. But here's the question.
We're getting into different shoes here. Yeah.
We're trying to get into some different shoes here, and this question might help us get there. In the mind of most Americans, which of our neighboring nations do you think that the United States should take over next and annex as part of the United States? Now, in that silence, probably you're gasping and thinking, like, are there any Americans who are thinking like, okay, do we go for Canada or Mexico next? Like, which one should we try to overrun? Because that's totally outside the modern concept of how America interacts with its neighbors. The reason that's helpful to recognize is that's totally different than how a significant number of other ideologies work. So let's go back. Soviet Union, like legitimate communism and Marxism. Marx said from the beginning, this doesn't work until everybody does it. And so if you look at Russia and China, their ambition is not like their version of a stronger, healthier Russia is like when the whole world is the Soviet Union. Or when the whole world is the Chinese Communist Party, they will be successful. So it's by definition, expansive and expanding and taking over ideology. Expansionist in that sense. Okay, now you can throw Islam in there, who sees itself, particularly in branches based in Iran and other parts of their neighbors, who Islam is a system that succeeds only when it eradicates everybody else and takes over the world. So the geographic borders around some of these countries are just what they've been forced to, but the geographic boundary does not contain the goals of the ideology. So for us, it doesn't make sense to think like, why doesn't Iran want Israel to exist? That would be like us saying we don't want Mexico to exist. And we're like, of course we want Mexico to exist. There's, wonderful culture, wonderful people there, good future trade partners, all sorts of, ways in which you could look at that and spin that as a positive direction. The difference is that the United States is not fundamentally oriented around a unifying set of principles, religiously speaking, that doesn't believe that Mexicans should exist. That's the difference here. And so, we're not going to be able to engage well with what's going on in the rest of the world until we kind of drill it into our thick skulls that most countries and a growing proportion of the world's global population thinks in necessarily ideologically driven expansionist terms. Now, immediately, let me jump to the fact that everybody should be throwing flags on the play and saying, Nathan, what in the world are you talking about? The U.S. has been deeply influential and monkeyed with all sorts of political systems all over the world. Yes, I take that point. That is not disputed. We've had our hands in and behind this.
Well,
I mean, you realize like the state of Panama exists because we helped that section of the country get away, like break off of Colombia in a civil war just so we could have the Panama Canal. Like, I mean, there's a lot of stuff like we've been involved.
Yes,
but Cameron wants to clarify a difference here.
Oh yeah. Yes, we have. So is America an interventionist nation? Yes, 100%. And some of these have been some of the major disasters of our country as well. I'm thinking of, the Vietnam War in particular and the after effects of that. I'm thinking also of, the war in Iraq. But you also have like
stability in global shipping historically that the U.S. has controlled against piracy also. So let's not make a value statement on that just yet. Let's just recognize that we are involved in other parts of the world.
Well, and a very important and very loaded phrase is nation building. And I'm drawing some of my thoughts here from a thinker named Richard Slotkin. He is perhaps best known. He's an intellectual historian. He wrote a massive trilogy of books on the role of violence in America, but one of probably the most famous was Gunfighter Nation. It's a very good book. But he talks about nation building, and this factored critically into the ambitions with the war in Vietnam. But basically, the idea really was to convert the nation to a Western way of life, to an American way of life. That was the hope. We will go into, so however you want to parse what actually took place and how it unfolded, the aspiration, and I think this was what was going on in Iraq as well, that the seemingly or the apparently noble aspiration was, we will go here, we will make sure that these people are liberated from tyranny and, the threats of political tyranny, and then we will give them the tools to self-govern so that they can know freedom in the same sense that we do in the United States. And then we'll have this will be better for everybody, by the way, in the same way that you just said, it's good that we have our Mexican and Canadian neighbors here. This is good for trade, good trade partners. So this is where John Mersheimer was really helpful. We'll go back to Mersheimer, whom Nathan discovered a while ago, and a lecture of his that went viral, I think 5 years or something after he had given it on the tensions at the time between Russia and Ukraine, which then erupted into all-out war, kind of made him a viral star. But he says we tend to, when I explain these kinds of tactics and strategies, I'm explaining the tactics and strategies of a 21st century politician and political vision. And a lot of people around the globe do not think like that at all. They think like 19th century politicians, or they think like even more ancient politicians, as Nathan was saying. They do think in terms of expansionism. They do think in terms of conquering. And whether that's communism or the theocratic vision that's inherent in Islam.
But we could throw the Romans and the British and every other empire, the Dutch. I mean,
absolutely right. Yeah, just crack a history book. I mean, this is there's nothing new. It's totally normal. What's abnormal, in a good way, I think both Nathan and I would say, what's abnormal is our way of life here in the West. There's a preciousness to it. There's a precariousness to it as well. There's a fragility to it. It's not something that just happens on accident. You don't drift into that kind of vision of freedom. I mean, there's a reason. I mean, America was seen from the beginning as a vast experiment. And the founders all saw it as extremely risky. And that's why they kept, if you read the founding fathers, they sound like a bunch of Sunday school teachers. And they weren't necessarily Christian. But the reason they do, they keep harping on about virtue and self-governance. And the reason they're doing that is because the American experiment, they saw it as inherently risky and fragile. And if people can't self-govern, then the whole thing doesn't work. Now that's kind of a little bit of a tangent here, but
that's another podcast.
That's
right
just to illustrate how that's another podcast, but that's just to illustrate how the way of life that we have in the West now is an achievement. It's not something that just happened.
You have to be able to say this is
looks
splendid.
a lot more like
you have to be able to say this is splendid, but we can't take its uniqueness for granted, or the rest of the world doesn't make sense to us.
Yeah. So that's the kind. So we tend to. So let's return to another point that we have made a few times, and that is that we Americans, we have a tendency to think that everybody wants exactly what we want, and we tend to we just tend to assume, hey, people in these various nations, they want that same vision of freedom. They want the same free market society that we have. They want those same opportunities. And it's not necessarily true, but there is a kernel of truth to it. And here's where so many unpredictable elements enter in here, Nathan, because in the past, I think, before the advent of the internet and really the smartphone, there was a time where it was possible, even in the wake of globalization, it was possible to screen the general population from the immense seductiveness of the Western way of life. But we have a friend and former colleague who's made it clear that in many Middle Eastern countries, people might be wearing, the women might be wearing burqas during the day and, abiding by the rules because it's in their best interest to do so. But at night, a lot of the young people sneak out and go clubbing. So they clearly want something that looks a little bit more Western than what's on the ground in their nations. So there's a growing disparity, I think, and this is truly me walking out on a limb and thinking out loud, but I think I'm sensing a growing disparity between the actual populations of these countries and the leadership.
That is
regarding
true.
The Western way of life.
Yeah, except in a lot of these countries, the leaders.
Now, I don't know how that affects geopolitical affairs, but yeah, that's true.
Well, let me offer an alternative way to think about this. In that, I think what globalization has done and an increase in communication is that so growing up in a rural area, I was aware that there were haves and have-nots. But it wasn't, I forget like what cities where like you travel, like for me growing up, it was an odd thing to like travel to cities where there were clear defining lines, like this side of the street. Clearly there's a whole lot more going on economically over here than there is on this side of the street. So you had people who could look across the street and see what they didn't have. Kind of, the looking through the fence, looking over the hedge kind of thing. And what the internet has done is allowed most of the world to look at the phenomenal wealth that America has generated and say, wait a second, our political system is not providing that for us. As soon as you see alternatives, then suddenly you have this comparative thing of saying, so wait a second, why don't we have that? And then it's out of the responses to that. You can blame somebody else. There's a foundation of conflict internationally. You can blame your own government. There's internal disruption there. There's that kind of thing going on. Where those are unsettling culturally, one way or the other. However, the flip side of that, though, Cameron, is that America has generated a lot of wealth, but it doesn't appear to have generated a lot of meaning. And so, what that does, I think, for the more nationalistic or communistic or Islam, caliphate based is that suddenly you have an expansionist ideology that looks at incredible wealth, which many of them have access to at the top, but also sees the American vision of the use of that wealth as something that is inherently destructive. And so if you're coming from a culture that highly values the roles of men and women and family and tradition and culture, and power and authority, and delights and feels safe in those structures. When you look at America, you're going to say, yeah, but they've got nothing to offer us in that sense. So there's this, I think there's an odd give and take there, where on one hand there's you get this out of Russia, I think, which would look at American culture and say functionally it is totally lost its mind. Clearly what we believe is better. So there, I don't know how to make the distinction of saying, on one hand, I think you could look through the fence at America from another country and say, man, they've got a lot of money. They have, $4 gas, and their inflation's only 8% or whatever. And that's amazing. How do we get that? But you could also look through that fence and say, yeah, but their families are a train wreck. Their, internal politics is confusing and ugly. There's radical divisions within the culture. Religiously, they have no clue what they're doing collectively, and it not look appealing. So I think you have simultaneously reasons to long for and to reject what you see in America when you're looking at this from somebody in southern Lebanon right now.
I think one way of looking at this too would be, if you live in southern Lebanon and you're seeing a lot of repressive, just horrendous stuff on a daily basis, you can peer through the fence and you can see that just the freedom to express yourself any way you see fit, to be whatever you want, as that can look tremendously seductive. On the other side, you find yourself in the U.S., where we are experiencing a crisis of meaning, where, there's a Starbucks on every corner. You can be whatever you want, but it doesn't really matter because you have no idea what you want to be in the first place, and none of it seems to matter. There seems to be no deep significance. And so we're all suffering from terrible bouts of depression, emptiness, loneliness, and isolation. You peer through that fence and you see a thick vision of moral cohesion that's clear and draws clear boundaries, gives a clear set of rules, tells you exactly who you are and what you should be doing.
How you fit in.
And that can look very appealing. How you fit in, how you matter. Your life does have purpose and have meaning. And there are things worth dying for. There are things bigger than your individual self and your wants and your whims and your wishes. Now that carries immense appeal as well. And we've dealt with that, and we've had the surreal experience, we've talked about this before, of upper middle class, largely Caucasian kids, or young people being recruited by some of these radical Islamic groups, and those recruitment efforts being very successful. And, initially when that happened, people were just shocked. I can't believe this is going on. And it took, anthropologists and sociologists to come along and say, well, no, actually, maybe things aren't as peachy over in your neck of the woods as you think they are.
Okay.
So that's just we're not trying to obscure anything. We're just trying to clarify some of the different experiences that we have. Yeah. In our different places, in our different contexts.
Yeah. Or reasons why it's difficult to think clearly about this, as an American.
Yeah.
Particularly. Now, we recognize that, not everybody listening to this, a majority, but a big chunk of you are listening to this from other places in the world. So shout out to you guys. You can correct us if we're wrong or not on our analysis here. But and for the Canadians and Mexicans listening, we are not advocating taking over your countries. Just let us say that here first. Cameron,
just want to be crystal clear on that.
We're crystal clear on that. Here's where, so for me though, I Islam is not attractive. When I look through the fence, I don't see a better vision of meaning because I'm a Christian and I'm part of a church and I'm part of a community. So I've already got that. So it's not tempting or alluring to me in the slightest. And then there's some other commitments that I have as an American that I was like, yeah, that's a step in the wrong direction. But this is where, if we can not go too deep into the weeds on this, it's important for us, I think, as American Christians in this moment to recognize, and this is, James Davis and Hunter is going to point this out to us, that the American experience is Christian to some degree and is influenced by a set of understandings of virtue and ethics that come from Christianity, but it is a hybrid. It's hybridized with the Enlightenment. And so the America that you live in has had, so when Cameron said, the founding fathers sounded like Sunday school teachers. Yeah, they did, but they were also using a whole lot of enlightenment principles about justice and equality and freedom. And it's this merger of these two things that creates what it means to be an American today. And it's important for us to recognize that as the church, so that we don't get seduced by things that are shiny but aren't meaningful, or that we lose our own convictions about where things really come from. And you might be saying, no, we're Christian. Okay, you don't get free speech and equal voting rights from the New Testament. Now, there are principles there that might lead to it, but just recognize what it means to be an American is not an entirely, we just got this from our Bible's story going on. And so I think it's really, really healthy for us as modern American Christians who are super pumped about being Americans and super pumped about being Christians to be able to take things apart there and say, yeah, here's where this is coming from and it's good. And here's where this is coming from and it's good, but not see them as the same thing. Because if we try to see them as the same thing, suddenly it lacks the interpretive and the explanatory value that's necessary in order to engage with A, what's going on in our own country, but then B, to understand what's going on in the rest of the world. I'll get Cameron to say that in a more articulate and clear way.
Well, I'm not sure I can do that. You are describing what James Davison Hunter labels as the hybrid enlightenment. And basically what that is just taking Enlightenment principles and grafting them onto the Christian heritage. That's what the founding fathers in the United States did. So yes, free speech and a lot of the political goods we take for granted, you're not going to find them directly in the Bible. You will find them as Enlightenment principles. But also, just to be clear, not trying to muddy the waters, just trying to be clear and honest here. We have to be clear about which Enlightenment we're talking about as well. So Americans, we did not seize on the radical Enlightenment, which led to the French Revolution. The American Revolution differed drastically from the French Revolution. And there was a lot of concern initially that the American Revolution would follow in the footsteps of France, which could have been just a very different story had that happened. It didn't. Mm-hmm. Why? Well, the Enlightenment we seized on was what is sometimes called the moral Enlightenment. It was largely based out of a lot of figures in Scotland, actually. And some of its major principles had to do with common sense, a rational ground for how we come at truth. So in other words, not as radical of an experiment, and it lent itself well to more political stability. Because at the time, mm-hmm. with the founding of America, what people were looking for was stability. Things were already uneasy to begin with, and so this material lent itself very well to that. So natural law theory played a big part in this as well. Natural law theory still has a massive influence on our thinking in ways we don't even recognize anymore. Even somebody as secular as John Rawls is drawing on some version of natural law theory to say that we arrive at our theories of justice based on shared kind of discoverable rational principles. That again, that's kind of I'm not sure I'm clarifying anything here. I'm saying, yes, we do. What we have in the United States is unique. Yeah.
Well, let me just, for those of you who are like banging your forehead on the steering wheel of your car right now, like what are they talking about? Why does this matter? Here's why this matters is that we have to, as followers of Christ, be able to separate out why we believe and why we're following certain ideas. And you can't take that for granted. And so like Cameron's talking here about whole systems of thought that we subconsciously have adopted, and maybe rightly so, and maybe they're good. But if you don't we're living in a metaphysical time, Cameron, in which it's like, I've used this analogy before, like, what are the ingredients? What's the labeling here? When you go to the supermarket and you pull something off the shelf, it has a list of the ingredients in it. And then you make a decision of like whether or not you want your kids eating yellow number 5 or whatever. Like you think through that. By and large, I don't think Christians are thinking like that right now in our social media consumption, in our mainstream media consumption, in the periodicals or the journals or the educational systems of saying like, what are the ingredients in here? And a lot of times you look at the ingredients and you say, hey, that's great. I like it. But if you can't parse out and trace the history of some of the ideas that are prevalent right now, it doesn't help you inoculate yourself against bad ideas. It doesn't help you help other people get out of bad ideas. And it doesn't stabilize your future. So I think maybe Cameron and I overdo it in our attempt, or maybe not, of just like we're wired to try to analyze like what's really behind and underneath this. And can we understand this? And in order to do that, we sometimes have to think not like an American or not like a Christian in order to make sense of what's going on in other parts of the world, and then know how to appropriately respond on our end. So this is just a wild ride, and it's a wild goose chase, but we catch the goose in the end here because we're saying, don't assume that the rest of the world thinks and believes and has the same motivations as you, and that will serve you well as you follow Christ.
Definitely. Hey, and on that note, I need to issue a retraction. I made a pretty hilarious mistake in our podcast where we were highlighting the publications. Do you know what it is? Okay, let's see if you know it. Let's see if you're right.
I was thinking of a different one. I'm not. Go.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. You can set me straight on the other one after this. But I said First Things magazine was founded by John Henry Newman. Yeah, that would be it. Cardinal John Henry Newman would have indeed been an illustrious founder of the magazine. However, Cardinal John Henry Newman died before First Things was founded. The person who founded First Things was Richard John Newhouse. And so I just wanted to state that for the record. Some of our listeners might have been hearing that and thought, wait, what? Henry Newman? No. So anyway, I was wrong. There's a retraction.
I think Cameron.
Apparently, I was wrong about something else, which is amazing.
I think in a podcast in which you are quoting directly from 10 different publications and their founding principles with no notes off the top of your head, we can give you a pass and not think less of you for confusing two last names that start with an N. So I'm going to give you a passing grade. But no, I think the only thing I was thinking when we talk about the American Revolution not following the French Revolution was chronologically after in the American Revolution in that sense.
That's right.
But ideologically, it could have followed in that. So that was just one clarification there. We were talking about the history of the idea, not the actual events of the actual
had it drawn on those same sources.
Correct. Yeah. It would have followed it in that way. So there you go. After
all right. Well,
half an hour, here's all the things we're wrong about. Tune in next time.
And just in case you missed it, you would be tuning into Thinking Out Loud, a podcast where we think out loud about current events and Christian hope.
Thanks for listening to Thinking Out Loud. If you'd like to learn more about what we do, book Nathan or Cameron, or if you'd like to support us financially, whether through a one-time donation or on a monthly basis, you can do so on the donate page at www.toltogether.com. That's toltogether.com. And please consider leaving us a 5-star rating and sharing this content with your friends. It really does help.